Think about it, for real. What would you do if you were in a room face to face with the most wanted man on the planet? In front of you is not just any criminal. It's the brain, the architect, the mind behind the day that changed the world forever. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11. A $50 million bounty on his head, now sitting just a few feet away from you. He knows everything. He knows the sleeper cells, the next targets, the names that could prevent the next catastrophe. All that critical information is locked inside that mind. But there's one problem, a monumental one. He refuses to talk. It's not passive silence, it's an act of war. His eyes radiate an icy disdain. His body, despite captivity, gives off an aura of control. He trained for this exact moment for years. He built an impenetrable psychological fortress, brick by brick, with conviction, ideology, and an ego the size of a continent. He isn't just a prisoner. He sees himself as a teacher, a sacred soldier in an epic battle. And in his mind, he's winning. Now put yourself in the shoes of the world's top intelligence experts. The pressure is unimaginable. Every second of silence could mean lives lost. The initial, almost instinctive response is force. The approach we've seen in 100 movies. Increase pressure, create discomfort, force submission. Old school intimidation. But with KSM, that tactic was a spectacular failure. Worse than a failure, it backfired. Every attempt to break his will physically only fed his martyr narrative. Every shout, every threat, was another brick reinforcing his wall of silence. Proof to himself that he was stronger than his captors. You've lived some version of this, on a much smaller scale, of course. That situation where the more you press someone, the more they retreat and shut down. A negotiation that stalls. An argument where logic is useless. A dead end where force only breeds more resistance. It's the essence of a clash of wills. And in those secret interrogation rooms, the free world was losing that battle. At that point of despair and failure, a radical shift began. A silent turning point, far from public view. Strategists realized they weren't fighting a body. They were fighting a mind. And to win a mental battle, you don't need muscle. You need a map of the human psyche. They had to abandon brute force and embrace persuasion engineering at its most extreme. The question stopped being, how do we make him talk? And became, what does he need psychologically to want to tell us his secrets? What you're about to discover may surprise you, because the tools used to unlock this human puzzle weren't what you'd expect. They reveal the deepest secrets of psychology under pressure at the moment of critical decisions. Stay with me to the end, because understanding how they transformed an unyielding enemy into a source of information is understanding the most powerful form of strategic influence that exists. The answer begins with the recognition of a colossal failure, a mistake that opened the door to a new and overwhelming kind of power. Subscribe. And that colossal failure, the mistake that opened the door to new power, was the simple, painful admission that brute force was useless. By trying to batter KSM like a door, they were merely testing the quality of the lock and discovering it was unbreakable. The error was to underestimate the complex psychology of resistance. They learned the hard way that when the human mind is driven by deep conviction, it doesn't bow to external pressure. It uses pressure as fuel. Pressure validated his struggle, confirmed his importance, and hardened his resolve. And you felt this dynamic yourself, in totally different contexts. It's the force that rises in a heated argument, a high-stakes negotiation, or when we're trying to convince someone we love of something important. We push, and the other side builds a wall. It's a universal human pattern, which is why this goes far beyond an espionage story. It touches the essence of how we connect, persuade, and influence each other. If this resonates, If you've been there, drop in the comments what struck you most about the idea that pressure can actually strengthen the other side. Your experience enriches this community and helps me see what truly resonates with you. And if this reflection flipped a switch inside you, if it made you think differently, your like is the quickest, strongest signal that we're on the right track and that this deep dive into applied psychology is worth it. Your participation, whether commenting or liking, is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like us, want to understand the gears behind human behavior. If you want to keep going on this journey, breaking down cases like this and, more importantly, learning how to apply these strategies in your own life, subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. Because it was this exact realization, that brute force was a dead end, that made the interrogators put away the whip and open, for the first time, the toolbox of psychology. And the first tool they pulled out was so surprising, so counterintuitive, that it changed the rules of interrogation forever. But before revealing that tool, we need to grasp the depth of the abyss they were in. The initial approach, as I said, was the one we all know from movies. Cold rooms, bright lights, sleep deprivation, intimidation, the controversial, enhanced interrogation techniques. Old school at full power, based on the belief that with enough pressure, anyone breaks. The problem is, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was not anyone. He was a master of endurance, a man whose identity had been forged in the fire of resistance. Behind the scenes, one hidden truth emerged about human nature. For a man like KSM, physical pain wasn't weakness, it was currency for spiritual strength. Every attempt to break him physically actually strengthened him psychologically. Think about it. Each act of aggression confirmed his martyr narrative. In his mind, he wasn't being tortured, he was being tested. And with each test passed, his ego, his conviction, and his sense of purpose grew stronger. He wasn't just resisting, he was winning a spiritual battle his captors didn't even know they were fighting. The impact was the opposite of what they wanted, creating a vicious cycle of ever stronger resistance. It was an epic failure to read the human being in front of them. Now let's go deeper. This teaches perhaps the first and most important lesson of strategic influence, a lesson that applies to any negotiation, any debate, any attempt at persuasion in your life. When external pressure meets strong internal conviction, conviction wins. Always. Trying to knock down deep conviction with brute force is like trying to fell an oak with a sigh. You won't, and the tree won't even notice. His mindset was that of a warrior in enemy territory. And what does a warrior do? He fights. By giving him a clear, aggressive enemy, interrogators were unknowingly giving him exactly what he needed to feel powerful. The hidden truth, the turning point, was this. The key wasn't to increase pressure, it was to remove it. If internal conviction beats external pressure resonates with you, comment, mindset is everything. They finally understood they couldn't beat his conviction head-on. The only way out was to stop fighting it and learn to dance with it, using the very strength of that monumental mindset against itself. And to learn that dance, you don't send a soldier, you send a partner who understands the rhythm. This is where the silent transformation happened behind the scenes of power. Seeing the monumental failure of their tactics, the CIA did something radical. They changed the experts in charge. Out went the masters of intimidation. In came the masters of the mind. They brought in psychologists, not to invent new forms of torture, but to do the opposite, to understand, to decode. They became the architects of the mind. The entire mission was re-engineered. The question echoing in the halls shifted from, how do we force him to talk, to something subtler and far more powerful. What does Khalid Sheikh Mohammed need, psychologically, to want to talk? Feel the depth of that shift. It's the difference between trying to break down a door and looking for the key already in the owner's pocket. That's the essence of persuasion engineering. It isn't about breaking someone's will, often impossible, but about redirecting it. Understanding that cooperation doesn't come from fear, but from an internal need no one had noticed. Deeper still, the greatest impact doesn't come from the force you apply, but the understanding you demonstrate. The psychologists saw that KSM, like any human being, was driven by psychological needs. The need to feel important, to have his intellect recognized, to maintain his status as a professor or evil genius. While the old interrogators attacked those needs, the new architects decided to feed them. They realized his silence wasn't just resistance, it was his only tool of power and control. To make him talk, they didn't have to remove his power. They had to offer him greater power. The power to teach, to display his brilliance, to be the center of attention. They shifted the game from a battle of wills to a transaction of egos. If you believe understanding beats forcing, right, empathy is the key. They stopped seeing him as a monster to be broken and began to see him as a complex system with its own rules and energy sources. And the first step in mapping that system was to identify and connect with his primary psychological fuel. And that primary fuel, the sun around which his entire mental galaxy orbited, was his ego. A colossal, academic ego that saw itself not only as a warrior, but as a teacher, an intellectual, a strategist superior to everyone in the room. Here the architects of the mind deployed their first secret weapon, a technique so absurdly counterintuitive it bordered on genius. Respect. Yes, respect. In one of the most hostile environments on Earth, the main instrument of influence became one of the most basic gestures of human civility. Intimidation ended. The game of respect and validation began. Interrogators transformed the dynamic. They stopped treating KSM like a filthy prisoner and began treating him as an intellectual peer, almost a valuable consultant. Instead of cutting off his long lectures on politics, religion, and history, they listened attentively. They asked questions. They showed genuine interest in his worldview. Behind the scenes, they even gave him a whiteboard and markers. Think about that. They effectively turned the interrogation room into a classroom, and KSM, the prisoner, into the professor. By validating his deep need to feel like a master strategist, they began disarming his defenses piece by piece. His wall had been built to resist a siege, a frontal assault. It had no defense against an invitation to open the gates and give a lecture. Deeper, this was the masterful application of a core psychological principle. Validation disarms hostility. Validation is not agreement. They didn't say, "You were right to do what you did." What they communicated was, "We see that you're intelligent, that your worldview is complex, and we want to understand it." Here's the hidden truth. Before we're willing to listen to someone, we need to feel we've been heard. By satisfying that primal need, they neutralized the main driver of his resistance. He no longer had to fight to prove his worth. His worth was being recognized. The mindset shift created the first crack in a fortress that had seemed impenetrable. They didn't attack the king. They invited the king to play chess and praised his moves. If you believe in validation as a bridge, comment. Respect disarms. But validating his identity and intellect was just the foundation. Once the door was unlocked with respect, the architects realized they could go further, not only recognizing his ego, but feeding it and using it as an engine for revelation. And that journey, using ego as the engine of revelation, was the second and perhaps most powerful phase of the operation. If respect opened the door, feeding the ego was walking in and taking a seat. the architects of the mind went beyond passive validation. They launched an active campaign to inflate KSM's ego to epic proportions. The treatment of intellectual peer evolved into superior master. Their stance came through in every question, every gesture. They positioned themselves deliberately as ignorant students before an unappreciated genius. The conversations, as the back channels reveal, were laced with lines like, "Khalid, we simply can't grasp the complexity of your plan. You're on another level. Please teach us how you did it." Or, "The way you organized everything. It's brilliant. We need the expert you to explain the details." They turned the interrogation into an exclusive masterclass. He wasn't confessing crimes. He was lecturing on his masterpiece to a captive, admiring audience. And what is a teacher's deepest desire? A genius's? An artist's? To showcase their work, to be recognized for their creation. By doing this, they executed a brilliant psychological shift. Speaking was no longer an act of betrayal. It became an act of self-affirmation. Deeper, this technique taps a hidden truth about the human psyche. Our need for significance often outweighs our logic of self-preservation. The impact of making him feel like the smartest man in the room was so strong that sharing information stopped being rational. It became emotional, driven by the dopamine hit of a stroked ego. They created an environment where silence diminished him, made him just another prisoner. Talking, on the other hand, elevated him, put him on the coveted professor pedestal. They gave him a choice, be a silent nobody or a speaking genius. For an ego like his, that wasn't a real choice. They didn't issue orders. They built a stage and invited him to be the star. Cooperation became the inevitable consequence of the environment. If you've seen ego steer decisions, comment. Ego speaks louder. They built the stage, inflated the lead actor's ego, and put him under the spotlight. All that was missing was the final trigger, the subtle human nudge that would turn performance into a cascade of real confessions. And that final trigger didn't come as a brilliant question or a clever trap. It came as a surrender. Narrator. The decisive moment, the revelation that changed the course of global intelligence, didn't happen in a cold cell under a fluorescent bulb. It happened in a conversation that felt casual, almost mundane. It became known as the balcony conversation. After months building respect and feeding the professor's ego, one of the lead psychologists, James Mitchell, made the boldest, most human move of all. He broke character. In an apparent moment of exhaustion, he turned to KSM and said something along the lines of, "You know, Khalid, I can't do this anymore. I'm exhausted. I'm going to resign and go home. But before I go, man to man, not as an interrogator, I need to know, will there be another attack? Will my family be safe?" Narrator. Consider the magnitude of that. In that instant, he took off the invisible CIA agent badge and became simply James, a worried father. It was the ultimate pattern break, a calculated vulnerability, an appeal that transcended politics, religion, and war. He wasn't asking for information for the US government. He was asking for advice to protect his family. Deeper, the psychological impact was seismic. First, it gave KSM a power he'd never had, the power of magnanimity. He was no longer the prisoner being forced to confess. He was suddenly elevated to advisor, the expert holding the key to another family's safety. The ego they had inflated for months found its highest purpose. Narrator. Second, Mitchell's vulnerability created a human bridge. The hidden truth at work, vulnerability, used strategically, isn't weakness. It's the most powerful form of strength. It invites reciprocity and disarms rigid defenses. The confrontation became a consultation, and in that inversion of power, the floodgates opened. KSM began to talk and didn't stop. If you believe human connection can break barriers, right vulnerability connects. Right there, in that unexpected moment of connection, the dam burst. But the most shocking revelation isn't what he said next. It's how the principles behind that moment translate perfectly from Guantanamo to our everyday battlefield. And this is where the backstage thriller becomes a practical manual for your life. You may be thinking, okay, fascinating psychological thriller, but how does this apply to me? I'm not interrogating a terrorist mastermind. You don't need to, because your battlefield, with different risks, runs on the same rules and invisible forces. You negotiate, persuade, and manage egos every day, getting a project approved, convincing a difficult client, asking your boss for a raise, or having a delicate conversation with your partner or your kids. The hidden truth is that the same psychological architecture at play in that cell is at play in your next sales call. The same forces, the deep human need to be truly heard, not just listened to, the hunger to feel important, the fierce defense of the ego when it's attacked. KSM's mindset, in essence, is an extreme version of mindsets we meet daily in defensive people, in those who feel undervalued, or in those who believe they're the smartest in the room. Failing to recognize these undercurrents leads to failed negotiations, endless conflict, and the frustration of not being able to connect. Deeper, think of your last tough negotiation, that unexpected no, that resistance that felt irrational. Chances are the battle wasn't being fought at the logical level, numbers and facts. The real battle was at the level of ego, status, and control. Your attempt to win with arguments may have been perceived as an attack, and the other person, like KSM, simply shut down, reinforcing their conviction. The big revelation is that by mastering validation, pattern breaks, and ego redirection, you gain an asymmetric advantage in any interaction. You stop fighting the current and start using its force, provoking a transformation in how people respond to you. If this bridge from grand strategy to daily life flipped a switch, comment, it's all psychology. In the end, every human interaction is a negotiation. Once you understand the rules of this invisible game, you stop playing defense and start designing the outcome. The first step in becoming the architect of your interactions is mastering a specific technique we can extract from this story, something we'll call the professor effect. That may be the most practical, immediately impactful tool in this whole journey. It's about consciously inverting the power dynamic in a difficult conversation. Instead of arriving with, "I need to prove my point," you adopt, "I need you to teach me yours." In practice, in conflict, our instinct is to attack the other person's logic. "You're wrong. That makes no sense. My idea is better." But when you do that, you're not attacking the idea. You're attacking the ego behind it. The response is always defense or counterattack. The professor effect flips it. Instead of confronting, you invite. Don't say, "You're wrong." Try, "Look, I don't have your experience on this. Help me understand your point of view." Or, "The way you reached that conclusion is interesting. Could you walk me through your reasoning?" With that simple shift, you hand the other person the whiteboard. You make them the expert, the teacher. And what happens when someone feels like a professor? The need to defend fades, replaced by the desire to teach and demonstrate knowledge. The effect: people are often shocked by how much they're willing to share and collaborate when they feel their expertise is genuinely valued. Deeper, the hidden truth behind the professor effect is that by yielding apparent power, you gain real control of the conversation. You become the director, guiding the professor to the topics you want. Through open, curious questions, true motivations and concerns, the backstage drivers of decisions rise to the surface. Often, in the rush to teach, the person reveals the weak points of their own argument or the unexamined assumptions beneath it. It's elegant persuasion because they don't feel convinced by you. They feel they reached a new conclusion themselves during the very class they were giving. It's the shift from confrontation to mutual discovery. If you're committed to testing the professor effect in your next hard conversation, comment student mode on. Mastering this gives you control over the opening and flow, but what do you do when pressure still rises and the negotiation threatens to explode? That's where a second practical lesson comes in: strategic patience. That is your cooling system in any human interaction, what keeps the engine from overheating. The first revelation from the KSM case is that he didn't give in a day or a week. It was a long game, a marathon of patience and persistence. Here's our lesson. In our negotiations, when tension rises, voices sharpen, a bomb is about to go off, our primary instinct is to accelerate, to win quickly before it all collapses. That's the worst decision. Strategic patience teaches the opposite. When pressure rises, don't raise yours. Step back. This isn't giving up. It's a tactical retreat. It creates space. In practice, it can be as simple as, you know, this point is important, and I want to give it the attention it deserves. How about we grab a coffee and resume in 5 minutes? Or, I feel we're reaching an impasse. Let's pause for today. I'll call you tomorrow morning with a clear head. Change the physical setting. Offer water. Simply walking to the coffee machine can break the confrontation pattern. Most powerful of all, borrow Mitchell's move. Ask a personal question that breaks the script. Speaking of pressure, how was your kid's game this weekend? That momentary detour acts as an emotional reset. Deeper, the hidden truth behind strategic patience is neuroscience. When emotions run high, our rational brain, the prefrontal cortex, is effectively hijacked by the amygdala. Trying logic then is like shouting into a storm. It doesn't work. A strategic pause lets physiology settle. The impact, logic, and emotion can find a new cooperative path. You stop seeing the negotiation as a single win or lose event and start seeing it as part of a relationship. Sometimes, to win the war, you need to retreat in a battle. This patience isn't passivity, it's supreme control over pace and emotional temperature. If you get that, sometimes stepping back is the best way forward. Comment? Long game. Combine the professor effect to open communication with strategic patience to sustain it, and you're not just using isolated tactics. You're operating with a new paradigm of influence. That's where real power lives. And that paradigm brings us to the final, most important lesson. Supreme power isn't force. It isn't pressure. It isn't intimidation. Supreme power is understanding. The KSM case, with all its layers of tension and backstage revelation, teaches the ultimate lesson of strategic influence. Real strength isn't imposing your will over another's. It's understanding the other's will so deeply that you can align it with your own. It's turning a clash of forces into an encounter of interests, even when those interests are buried under layers of ego and resistance. Whether in the extreme setting of a cell in Guantanamo or a tense meeting about next year's budget at your company, the principle is the same. Those who understand psychology don't need to use force. Those who can hear unspoken needs, validate an ego and then redirect it, who have the patience to let the dust settle before key decisions. Those people don't need to shout. They don't need to threaten. They lead, they influence. They reach their goals, not by breaking others' wills, but by making others want to walk in the same direction. Deeper, this isn't empty manipulation. It's elevated strategic empathy, recognizing that every human operates by psychological rules. Instead of ignoring or fighting those rules, you use them to build bridges. The hidden truth, the great secret the architects of the mind applied, is that the shortest path between 2 points in any human interaction isn't a straight, aggressive line of logic, but a gentle curve of psychological understanding. It's shifting from "what do I want" to "what do they need," so that they'll want the same thing I do. That change in perspective is the journey that separates amateurs from masters of influence, the difference between forcing outcomes and inspiring them. If you're leaving this video with a new vision of true power, comment, "Understanding is strength." You now know the principles behind the most complex interactions. You have practical tools to apply them. The only question left, the decision only you can make, is what will you build with them? And if you've come this far with me, through this journey into the backstage of the mind, it means you're not chasing quick tricks. You're after a deeper understanding of human behavior. That's a quest that connects us. If something here touched you, if an idea sparked a new reflection, your like is the most genuine way to tell me the connection we built over these minutes was real. And if you want to keep accessing this kind of analysis, to uncover the engineering behind persuasion and master the tools of strategic influence, subscribe. That's our pact to keep exploring together. Here, we always go deep. To let me know who truly dove in and stayed to the end, leave a discreet comment with the phrase, "The turning point." That's how I'll know you're part of the group who really caught the core message of this video. Our conversation doesn't have to end now, it's just beginning. There's a video on the screen that's the perfect next step. It complements exactly what we discussed here. Click it, and let's continue this talk there. See you in the next video.